The world watched in horror as the events of September 11, 2001, unfolded. The attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon shook the United States to its core, leaving a nation grappling with grief, anger, and a profound sense of vulnerability. In the immediate aftermath, a wave of patriotism and unity swept across the country, but amidst the chaos and mourning, questions lingered. How could such a tragedy occur? Who was responsible? And how should the United States respond? Noam Chomsky, a renowned political activist, linguist, and philosopher, offered a different perspective on these events in his book, 9/11. Published just weeks after the attacks, the book quickly gained international attention for its critical analysis of the events and their implications. Chomsky's work delves into the historical context of U.S. foreign policy, challenging the dominant narrative surrounding the attacks and prompting readers to question conventional wisdom. Chomsky's 9/11 is not merely a commentary on the attacks themselves but a searing indictment of what he views as the failures of U.S. foreign policy and the manipulation of public perception. He argues that understanding the attacks requires a deeper examination of the long-standing grievances held against the United States, particularly in the Middle East. Chomsky posits that the events of 9/11, while horrific, were not unprovoked, urging readers to consider the historical context and potential motivations behind them. By tracing the history of U.S. involvement in the region, Chomsky aims to expose the hypocrisy and contradictions inherent in the war on terror narrative that emerged after 9/11. He challenges the prevailing notion of the United States as a benevolent superpower, instead presenting a more nuanced and critical perspective on its role in global affairs. Chomsky's analysis is rooted in his belief that understanding the root causes of terrorism is essential to formulating effective solutions, arguing that simply resorting to military force will only perpetuate a cycle of violence. Chomsky contends that the Bush administration's response to the 9/11 attacks was characterized by fear-mongering and the exploitation of national tragedy for political gain. He argues that the administration used the attacks as a pretext to advance a pre-existing agenda of military expansionism and global dominance, capitalizing on public fear and anger to justify the invasion of Afghanistan and later, Iraq. Chomsky meticulously deconstructs the Bush administration's claims regarding Iraq's alleged possession of weapons of mass destruction, highlighting the lack of evidence and the manipulation of intelligence to fit a predetermined narrative. Furthermore, Chomsky critiques the mainstream media's role in perpetuating the administration's narrative, arguing that they largely failed to challenge official pronouncements, and instead acted as a mouthpiece for the government's perspective. He accuses the media of neglecting its duty to provide critical analysis and dissenting viewpoints, thereby contributing to a climate of fear and unquestioning support for the war on terror. Chomsky's analysis of the media's role highlights the importance of independent journalism and critical thinking in holding power to account. Chomsky's critique of U.S. foreign policy extends beyond the immediate aftermath of 9/11, delving into the historical context that he believes led to the attacks. He argues that the United States' long history of interventionism in the Middle East, often driven by economic and geopolitical interests, has fueled anti-American sentiment and created a breeding ground for extremism. Chomsky points to specific examples, such as the U.S. support for authoritarian regimes in the region and its role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as contributing factors to the resentment that ultimately manifested in the 9/11 attacks. Chomsky's analysis challenges readers to consider the unintended consequences of U.S. foreign policy, arguing that actions taken in the name of national security can often have the opposite effect, creating instability and breeding new threats. He emphasizes the need for a more nuanced and diplomatic approach to international relations, one that prioritizes dialogue, understanding, and mutual respect over military might. Chomsky's work serves as a stark reminder that addressing the root causes of terrorism requires a long-term commitment to justice, equality, and the peaceful resolution of conflict. "9. 11 is a powerful and provocative work that challenges readers to critically examine the events of September 11th and their aftermath. Chomsky's analysis is characterized by its rigorous scholarship, sharp wit, and unwavering commitment to social justice. He deftly weaves together historical analysis, political commentary, and personal reflections to provide a compelling critique of U.S. foreign policy and its impact on the world. One of Chomsky's most compelling arguments is that the war on terror launched by the Bush administration in response to the 9/11 attacks was fundamentally misguided. He contends that the administration used the attacks as a pretext to justify a pre-existing agenda of military expansionism and global dominance, cynically exploiting public fear and anger to advance its own interests. Chomsky points to the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq as prime examples of this strategy, arguing that both wars were based on false pretenses and have ultimately made the world a more dangerous place. Foreign policy, but also a call to action. He urges readers to challenge the dominant narrative surrounding the attacks and to demand a more just and peaceful world. Chomsky believes that a more sustainable and equitable global order requires a fundamental shift in U.S. foreign policy, one that prioritizes diplomacy, cooperation, and mutual respect over military might. His work serves as a powerful reminder that the fight against terrorism cannot be won through violence alone, but requires addressing the root causes of extremism and injustice. In the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the United States grappled with the unimaginable. The collapse of the Twin Towers, the attack on the Pentagon's symbolic blows to American power and identity. A nation accustomed to projecting strength suddenly seemed vulnerable, its citizens united in grief and a thirst for answers. In this charged atmosphere, Chomsky began his analysis. He argued the dominant narrative of unprovoked acts of hatred was an oversimplification. While acknowledging the horror and suffering, Chomsky urged a deeper historical examination. Understanding motivations didn't justify actions, but was crucial to preventing future tragedies. Viewing 9/11 as an isolated incident, divorced from global politics and history, missed a critical opportunity for introspection and change. Chomsky pointed to the pervasive sense of shock and disbelief that gripped the nation, highlighting how this very shock reflected a certain blindness to the realities outside America's borders. He argued that for many in the West, the attacks shattered a perceived invulnerability, a belief that such violence was something that happened over there, not on American soil. This, he argued, was a dangerous illusion, one that had allowed for a foreign policy to be conducted with a degree of detachment from its consequences. The Bush administration's swift declaration of a war on terror met with overwhelming public support was, for Chomsky, a predictable yet deeply troubling development. He saw it as a knee-jerk reaction, one that played into existing fears and anxieties while stifling any nuanced discussion of root causes or alternative solutions. The framing of the conflict in such stark, absolutist terms, he argued, was precisely the kind of Manichaean worldview that extremists sought to provoke. Central to Chomsky's analysis was his assertion that the 9/11 attacks, while horrific, were not unprovoked. He argued that they needed to be understood within the broader context of U.S. foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East. He presented a scathing critique of what he saw as decades of U.S. interventionism in the region, often driven by a desire to secure access to oil, maintain strategic dominance, and support authoritarian regimes considered friendly to American interests. Chomsky argued that the U.S. often exhibited a double standard in its foreign policy, condemning human rights abuses while simultaneously supporting regimes that committed them, as long as they aligned with American geopolitical interests. This hypocrisy, he argued, was not lost on those living in the affected regions, fostering a deep sense of anger and injustice. Chomsky, drawing on his earlier work on propaganda and media, argued that the Bush administration, in the aftermath of 9/11, effectively used the media to manufacture consent for its war on terror. He argued that the media, rather than providing critical analysis and challenging official narratives, largely served as a mouthpiece for the government, uncritically amplifying its message of fear and retribution. He pointed to the repeated use of emotionally charged language, the framing of complex geopolitical issues in simplistic US versus them terms, and the constant invocation of 9/11 as justification for any and all actions taken in the name of national security. This relentless barrage of pro-war messaging, he argued, created an environment in which dissenting voices were marginalized and any opposition to the administration's policies was viewed as unpatriotic or even treasonous. Chomsky argued that this manipulation of public opinion was not unique to the Bush administration but rather reflected a broader pattern in American history. He cited earlier examples such as the Vietnam War, where the government had used similar tactics to shape public perception and stifle dissent. For Chomsky, understanding how consent was manufactured was crucial to challenging the dominant narrative and fostering a more informed and engaged citizenry. He believed that a truly democratic society required a vigilant and critical media, one that held power to account and provided a platform for a diversity of viewpoints, even and perhaps especially those that challenged the status quo. Chomsky's critique of the U.S. response to 9/11 centers on the very phrase chosen to define it, the war on terror. He argues that this framing, while emotionally resonant, is inherently flawed and ultimately counterproductive. For Chomsky, terrorism is not an entity in itself, but a tactic. To declare war on a tactic, he argues, is akin to declaring war on frontal assault or naval blockade. It betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the problem. Chomsky dismantles the administration's claims that the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq were justified acts of self-defense. He highlights the lack of credible evidence linking Iraq to 9/11s and the shifting justifications for the invasion. For Chomsky, these wars were about expanding American power in a strategically vital region. He argues that the Iraq invasion exemplifies preventive war, attacking preemptively without an imminent threat. This doctrine, Chomsky argues, sets a dangerous precedent, allowing powerful states to attack weaker ones with impunity. Chomsky critiques the war on terror, linking it to American foreign policy and imperialism. He argues 9/11 was a symptom of American imperialism. Since World War II, the U.S. has pursued global hegemony. This has led to devastating consequences, especially in the global South. Chomsky introduces the concept of blowback, a term coined by the CIA to describe the unintended consequences of covert operations to explain the rise of anti-American sentiment and the eventual eruption of violence that manifested in the 9/11 attacks. He argues that the United States, through its actions abroad, has consistently sown the seeds of its own destruction, creating the very enemies it now claims to be fighting. He points to the U.S. support for brutal dictatorships in the Middle East, often chosen for their willingness to align with American interests, rather than their commitment to human rights or democratic values. These regimes, Chomsky argues, while serving as reliable allies in the Cold War and beyond, often suppressed dissent with brutal force, creating a pressure cooker of resentment and anger that eventually boiled over. Chomsky's analysis of 9/11 and its aftermath is not merely a critique of American foreign policy, it is also a call for a fundamental rethinking of how the United States engages with the world. He argues that the war on terror, with its emphasis on military solutions and its disregard for root causes, is doomed to fail, only serving to perpetuate the cycle of violence and further alienate those it claims to be liberating. He advocates for a foreign policy grounded in diplomacy, mutual respect, and a genuine commitment to international law and human rights. He argues that the United States, instead of resorting to military force as a first option, should prioritize dialogue, engagement, and a genuine effort to understand and address the grievances of those who feel marginalized and oppressed. The consequences of the 9/11 attacks and the subsequent war on terror extended far beyond the borders of the United States, sending shockwaves across the globe and profoundly reshaping the geopolitical landscape. Chomsky argues that the Bush administration's actions, far from making the world safer, had the opposite effect, destabilizing entire regions, fueling extremism, and undermining international law and cooperation. He points to the invasion of Iraq as a prime example of this destructive dynamic. The war, launched on false pretenses and waged with little regard for civilian casualties, created a power vacuum that allowed sectarian violence to flourish and gave rise to extremist groups like ISIS. The ripple effects of this destabilization were felt far beyond Iraq's borders, contributing to the Syrian civil war, the refugee crisis in Europe, and the spread of terrorism across the Middle East and Africa. Chomsky argues that the September 11th attacks and the subsequent war on terror had a profound impact not only on the United States' role in the world, but also on its domestic politics and society. He contends that the Bush administration, in its zeal to combat terrorism, eroded civil liberties, expanded government surveillance powers, and created a climate of fear and suspicion that undermined the very freedoms it claimed to be defending. He points to the passage of the Patriot Act, a sweeping piece of legislation passed in the wake of September 11th, as a prime example of this erosion of civil liberties. The Patriot Act, Chomsky argues, expanded the government's ability to conduct surveillance on its citizens, detain suspects without charge, and prosecute individuals for activities that were previously protected under the First Amendment. Chomsky argues that the war on terror, far from making the United States safer, has created a perpetual state of insecurity, diverting resources from more pressing domestic needs and undermining the very foundations of a free and open society. He contends that the trillions of dollars spent on military interventions, surveillance programs, and homeland security measures have come at the expense of investments in education, healthcare, infrastructure, and other social programs that are essential to the well-being of the American people. He argues that the war on terror has created a self-fulfilling prophecy, fueling the very extremism it seeks to combat. By invading countries, propping up dictators, and engaging in extrajudicial killings, Chomsky argues, the U.S. has alienated vast segments of the global population, creating a breeding ground for resentment and radicalization. The events of September 11, 2001, fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape and ushered in the war on terror. Noam Chomsky's 9/11 critiques the U.S. response, challenging the narrative of unprovoked aggression and exposing flaws in American foreign policy. Chomsky's analysis remains relevant today, highlighting the consequences of militarism and interventionism. Chomsky's work is essential for understanding the post-9/11 world. He urges readers to question U.S. foreign policy and engage in critical thinking. Chomsky debunks the myth of American exceptionalism, revealing uncomfortable truths. He argues the U.S. should be judged by its impact, not its rhetoric. Chomsky's 9/11 is not a message of despair but rather a call to action. He argues for a future where the U.S. embraces diplomacy over militarism and cooperation over coercion. True security comes from mutual understanding, respect, and addressing root causes of conflict. Chomsky advocates for a foreign policy grounded in diplomacy, international law, and human rights. He calls for building bridges, fostering economic development, and promoting democracy. The U.S. can lead in creating a more just and peaceful world. Chomsky's vision requires rejecting the zero-sum mentality in international relations. Global challenges like climate change and pandemics need collective action. He calls for multilateralism, diplomacy, and cooperation to address existential threats. Chomsky's 9/11 critiques U.S. foreign policy and calls for a more just world. Security lies in diplomacy, cooperation, and shared human values. Chomsky's insights offer a roadmap for a future grounded in peace, justice, and equity.